Alright guys, Willem here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back talking about The Last of Us once again, because I seemingly can't stop talking about The Last of Us. However, I've already done a 6-hour retrospective on the original game, along with a cutscene ranking. However, here I decided, why stop there? And here I'll be doing a ranking of every character in The Last of Us, which is a video that was mentioned by Soraquill, my Twitch chat, who kind of made me want to do this video. And again, it's just another opportunity for me to talk about my love of The Last of Us. So here I'll be ranking every named character from the original Last of Us video game. Now again, this will only be including part 1, not part 2, and I should also clarify what exact characters I'll be ranking here, as there will be 14 characters on the list here, those being the 13 characters that are actually listed in the credits of the original game, alongside Riley from Left Behind, just because why not, because when else am I going to talk about Riley on a character ranking like this? However, it will not be including certain other named characters that were in the game, like Jerry, who is technically not named in Last of Us 1, wasn't named until Last of Us 2, and even then doesn't really have that major role in this individual game to where I felt okay leaving him off of it. I'm also not going to include a character like Frank, who doesn't even make an in-game appearance while alive, so again, I didn't feel like it was worth ranking him. Ish is a character that, again, Ozzy never actually appears in person. So while we do know his name and do know a lot about him, I did not feel like it was worth ranking him alongside a character like Ethan, the guy that Joel kills at the beginning of the hospital chapter, as again, he's not in the credits, but also his character's kind of irrelevant. Also, his name is kind of just added in there as an offhand comment more so than it being actual purposeful, and it really is just such a minor character. And really, characters of his caliber as well will just simply not be on the list. But again, this list will be including whatever characters were in the main credits alongside Riley. And straight up, I don't think there is a truly bad Last of Us character. I do think The Last of Us is a game that is obviously really well written from my point of view, to where I feel like its character work is some of the best aspects of the game. And while I do feel like there are certain characters that are simply just not as important as certain other ones, I don't think there is a outright bad character on the list. However, we are going to be starting off the list here at number 14. So the worst named character in The Last of Us for me ends up being James. If you don't know who James is, he is David's second command, his right-hand man during the winter chapter. And really, he's at 14 here, largely because he's so irrelevant. Again, I do find it funny that he's even in the credits, considering how minor of a role he has, though. Again, he's there. He does question David's leadership to a degree. He does almost help David in chopping Ellie up, so that's something. But again, as a whole, obviously not super relevant of a character, which is largely the reason why he's at the bottom here, because again, he's not portrayed poorly. There's not really anything truly negative to say about him. There's just also not much really positive to say, and because he's at the bottom at 14. Number 13, kind of a similar thing, though I think there's a couple things holding this person up slightly more than James, and that person is Robert, who is literally there for one scene, the scene where he's tortured to death by Joel and Tess. And I feel like the reason why he is higher than James for me is because at least he is more important to the overall plot. Like, if you were to say the plot of The Last of Us, James could literally just never be mentioned and everything would be fine. However, Robert is a character that is very integral to the overall plot, being a character that causes Joel and Tess to go on the adventure that they do, that leads to them meeting Ellie, which leads to the rest of the story. So again, just because of that, Robert is more integral to the story, but also still has a singular scene that is almost primarily focused on him. While James, again, is just a side character that is easily forgettable, I feel like Robert is still a character that you kind of have to remember, just due to how impactful his torture scene ends up being. But even in that, shows more character traits than James ever does, so because that for me, he's here at 13. Now number 12, and now we're finally getting to characters with a bit more significant of screen time, characters that were in more than just one scene. But at number 12, we have a character that just never really clicked with me. I've said this in the past, probably one of the characters that is probably better in the HBO show than in the original game, and that character is Maria. And again, for me, Maria is a character that just isn't given much depth in the story of the original game. I mean, she is simply there as Tommy's spouse and this figure to give purpose to Tommy while also acting as this mother figure for like one scene for Ellie. Like, I don't feel like Maria is given that much to do here, which I think is a shame because I think there are things to give her to do. I mean, as I said with the HBO show, I do really like these parallels they draw between Joel and Maria and show Maria essentially as this antithesis to Joel, which, I mean, thematically, it is kind of there in the original game, though it's never really said or never really tackled in any significant way. And because that's kind of left with Maria just simply just being there with not much to really do. Now, again, she doesn't come off negatively. She just really doesn't have much to really progress the overall story. And because of that, for me, she is here at number 12. Now, number 11, another one of these characters that, as I said, was probably improved in the HBO version of the show. Though, again, still not entirely bad. And at 11, I do have Sam. And again, for me, Sam is a character that really, again, isn't given much to do until his final scene. I think up until his final scene, he's simply just there to be there for the Joel and Henry parallels, being this character to parallel with Ellie, essentially showing what happens if this protector figure doesn't put their trust in you. Though I will say the thing that does elevate Sam above Maria for me is his final scene. I do think his final scene of his conversation with Ellie is just extremely tragic and gives a lot more depth to the character to me, and his essentially talking through his fear of death and also his lack of belief in religion, which is just this really interesting scene to come from Sam there, and a minor aspect of depth that's given to him that's more so than Maria, which leaves him here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a character that I think is largely this high because of how they affect one of the main characters in the game. I think as an individual character on their own right, they're just simply fine, and that character is Sarah. Obviously being one of the most important characters in the entire game, being this character that largely influences the character of Joel after her death. Though in her own right, she's kind of just fine. I mean, she has this fun banter between her and Joel. You can clearly tell this loving connection between the two, and also you end up playing as Sarah, which leads to this deeper bond between the player and Sarah by the time of her death. Though outside that, again, she's kind of just fine. She's okay. She's likable, but she's also not really in the game that much. While she is very important to the overall events of the game, I do feel like her minimal role in the story and her lack of screen time does kind of land her here, number 10. At number 9, we're moving on to a character in a similar vein, though does get a bit more screen time and more personality displayed through that. And at number 9, we do have Riley, who obviously is the only character here exclusively from Left Behind. And I think that does end up impacting my ranking of her as well, though where straight up, I just do not have as deep of a connection to Left Behind as I do the original game, and through that, Riley being obviously a character that's only in Left Behind does kind of struggle with being much higher on the list because of that in comparison to these characters from this story that I care a lot more about. However, Riley is still a great character. Again, I do like her connection to Ellie and how she impacts Ellie's life after her death. I do enjoy seeing this downtime between Ellie and Riley during the Left Behind DLC, and overall I do think Riley is very well acted, and just as a whole, Riley is a solid character, the one that I do think just again in comparison to the characters from the main story, I do struggle putting her much higher, but she's still solid in her own right, and she's here at number 9. Now number 8, and I think this is where we're getting to some tough choices for me, where I feel like every character we've talked about so far, I think those are pretty easy to rank. Like the top 2 of this list are also very easy to rank. However, it's the middle 6 here that we're about to talk about that are all extremely close, where, as I said, The Last of Us is void of bad characters. Again, for me, there are these characters that are more important than others. However, I feel like the next 6 characters are on a similar level of importance, where a lot of them do serve as these parallels to certain other characters, or have these pretty important roles to play in the grander story, but are simply not the top 2 characters. And I think that kind of makes a lot of these really hard to land. That number 8, we're going to start off with the character that is definitely the least likable of the 6 here. That character is David, who again, I think is very tough to rank because I think as a whole, for what his role in the story is supposed to be, I think it is executed very well. Again, he is supposed to be the worst of mankind, this massive low point for the character of Ellie and showing her the downsides of humanity. And I think David really embodies that in a really satisfying way, showing this anti-Joel figure, this destructive protector figure that is really just planning on grooming Ellie, and really just makes David a really despicable person here, but it is his unlikability that really makes him a really interesting character. Now, I will say I do think the overall writing of his character is a bit over the top at points, though I do think he is brilliantly portrayed by Nolan North. He does a really strong job at really bringing his character to life. And again, I do think as a whole, it's just a character I do have a tough time really assessing, just due to the fact that my criticisms of the character are also part of what makes the character great. And him being this over-the-top black and white villainous figure that would typically be an issue. However, that's also the point of his character to be that way. So despite him being at the bottom of this middle 6, he's still a very strong character in his own right, and he's here number 8. Now number 7, and really for the next 3 characters we'll be talking about, they all serve very similar purposes in the story, essentially being these mirrors for Joel. What's strange is that these 3 all have different pros and cons. However, I feel like this character just simply has less pros, barely. At number 7, I do have Henry. And again, Henry is just a bit of a weird one here, where of the next 2 we're going to be talking about, one of them is probably the least integral to the overall story, though is probably the best individual character, while another one is probably the most impactful to the original story, though is probably the less interesting individual character. Well, Henry is kind of second in both aspects, but because of that, he kind of ends up being dropped to the bottom of the 3, just simply because he's not really the best at anything. Again, he is a likable character, the one that doesn't really elevate too much beyond that. It was also one that has minor importance to the overall story, but is still not super important, where he essentially serves as this parallel to Joel and showing what would have happened to Joel if he didn't trust Ellie, while also showing Joel the dangers of getting close to someone again, showing obviously the death of Sam causing Henry to lose his own life. And again, it is a decent impact on the story there, though again, still not nearly as strong as one of the characters we'll be talking about in a little bit, but it's still a good character through and through. Again, I do really like Henry. I remember being devastated at his death, and it's still a really likable figure, the one that I just feel like in comparison to the other 2, I feel like they really excel at a certain aspect. Their characters a bit more than Henry does, and because that Henry's here at number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to a character that this is the character of the 3 that I do think is probably the best individual character. The character that is just the most interesting to watch, however also plays less of a role in the grander story, and that character is Bill. And straight up coming into this list, I very much expected Bill to be higher on the list. When I think of this game, I do think of Bill as one of the better side characters, and I stand by that comment. I do think he is a character that is just a really fun character to watch. Again, I love listening to a lot of Bill's dialogue and his banter with Ellie and Joel, and from a pure raw character standpoint, he is probably the most entertaining of this entire game. However, he's also a character that, while he does serve as his parallel to Joel and showing what will happen to Joel if he continues to push people away, while I think that mirroring is done pretty successfully, it's also not entirely necessary to me, to where I do feel like you could cut out Bill's part of the story and not much would really change, which kind of makes it a bit tough to really assess his character, where he is a largely irrelevant character, but also just a really fun character. And to be honest, I did consider putting him higher on this list. However, I think the thing that stepped me back from doing that is the fact that I do wish that Bill's character had a bit of growth to it. I do feel like his lack of development over the course of his adventures with Joel and Ellie is kind of what sets him back for me, to where he kind of starts and ends the Billstown chapter in the same spot. I do wish there was a little bit of development from him, or that would have elevated him a little bit, but he's still a pretty solid character. Again, a character with really great dialogue, and that's why he's here number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to, again, the top of this mini tier here, a character that I think serves as a parallel to Joel, but does so in a way that really ends up impacting the story, really ends up being a bulk of the ending of the story and the dilemma with the ending of the story. At number 5, I do have Marlene. Now again, straight up, I obviously like Bill and Henry more. Do I like Marlene's character, especially more so than Bill and Henry? No. I do think Marlene kind of fills her role fine enough. Like, I don't think she really does much to really excel beyond that, where you have like Henry who has a lot of charisma and Bill who has really fun banter. Like, to me, Marlene in her own right is probably the least interesting of the 3 there. However, what I do love from Marlene are her parallels with Joel, where again, I do love the complexity she adds to the ending of this game. The fact that she is in this position very similar to Joel, having this personal connection to Ellie, and ends up having the opposite reaction to Joel to this. Still being resolute in sacrificing Ellie for the sake of humanity, which ends up being this really big test for Joel. Leaving Marlene in this position of her doing what she thinks is best for all of mankind over her own personal needs, something that Joel is unable to do, and mixing that in with the added complexity of her recordings, where we learn about her relationship with Anna and her apologizing for not being able to save Ellie, and all this is just really great content to me for Marlene. I do really love the complexity they give to her in terms of making her this opposing point of view for Joel. Ends up being a major reason why she's as high on the list as she is here, as again, I think straight up, if we're going purely based off of how much enjoyment I get from seeing her on screen, she's probably down at like number 10 on this list. But I do think her overall parallels to Joel and the complexity she's given there is enough to land her here at number 5. At number 4, we're moving on to a character that I think is kind of another one of these that I think is mostly this high due to their chemistry with a certain other character, where I think as a whole, on their own, the character itself is kind of just fine, though this character is involved in a lot of my favorite scenes of the game, and that character is Tommy. Where, again, for me, a lot of what makes Tommy great in this game is his connection to Joel. I do think the charisma for a lot of their scenes together is really, really strong, and their argument in Tommy's office is a really great scene. I really love the back and forth there, and Joel trying to sell Tommy on the idea of taking Ellie, only for Tommy to not relent. You also have the final scene with them during the Tommy's Dam chapter, to where Tommy offers Joel a spot in Jackson. Again, all this is really strong, though I do feel like a lot of it is still predicated on Joel. I do feel like it is Joel that really lifts Tommy's ranking here, because I think outside that, Tommy's just fine. Now, again, Tommy's still good. I do think Tommy is a still interesting character, of this character that still holds out hope for humanity during the outbreak and is able to essentially rebuild society through him building up Jackson alongside Maria. And we also get a great display of his love for his brother, which threw him deciding to take Ellie off Joel's hands. And again, all this is really great. And Tommy is still a great character, one that does come off as really likable, though again, I just feel like a lot of that is predicated on his connection to Joel. And really, in scenes that aren't related to that, I do think he largely just comes off as just kind of okay. So that is kind of why he isn't at least a spot higher here, and he's here at number 4. Next up at number 3, we're moving on to a character, again, is in a similar tier to Tommy. However, I think it's just slightly better, because I think this character has more scenes on their own right that stick out, and that character is Tess. And again, I've said this in the past, Tess is one of the most important characters to the overall story. I mean, she is the one that convinces Joel to take Ellie, which it really ends up propelling the entire plot of the story, along with the fact that she is the one to get caught by Robert earlier on. That, again, she is essentially the entire impetus of the story. Though, even beyond that, again, Tess is just a likable character. Again, she is this likable sidekick for Joel, where they have some great banter between the two. However, even outside that, she has some great scenes on her own. Again, the scene of her shooting first during the standoff of Robert's men is a really notable scene. I really like the charisma she exudes during her initial conversation with Joel and explaining to him what happened with Robert's men. We obviously have her death scene, which is one of my favorite scenes in the entire game. This great back and forth between her and Joel, where she exudes so much emotion there and has this great redemption arc for her. That's pretty satisfying to see, even though, again, a little bit underdeveloped. But as a whole, again, I think Tess is a really strong character, a really likable one that is, again, this nice sidekick to Joel and has this great banter with him, while also having some pretty strong moments here and there. So she's here at number 3. Now number 2, and again, who would have guessed this top 2, where it's obviously Joel and Ellie. Again, obviously, the question was the order. However, for me, there was no real doubt. At number 2, I do have Ellie. And again, Ellie is a fantastic character. Obviously, Ellie is probably my favorite female character in all of gaming. I do feel like she's still one of my top characters in all of gaming. However, I feel like in part 1 here, while she is a very strong character, I feel like a lot of her character is still based around her interactions with the number 1 pick. I do feel like she's a character that, again, is a fun individual character, has some great funny lines here and there. She has some great comedic timing, has some fun banter characters at points. She has this great range of emotions throughout the game, while is also still a playable character towards the end of the game, and through that ends up connecting us with her a bit more. Also having us see her go through these really dark events revolving around David and her overcoming that. We also have her survivor guilt and her struggles of overcoming that, and her want for redemption that doesn't really go through due to Joel. But again, she's obviously a fantastic character across this game. However, I just feel like for me it's not particularly close on who the number one character is. Or again, for me, when I think of The Last of Us and the complexities of its story, I do largely think about what happens with the other character over Ellie, and because that Ellie's left here at number 2. But at number 1, the best character in The Last of Us for me is not even close. It is obviously Joel. And I mean, I've said this before, I think Joel's probably my favorite character in all of media, let alone just The Last of Us, let alone just video games. Like, I think Joel is a character that really excels beyond all that. I think he is a fantastic character through and through, a character that is somehow likable, but also a monster all at the same time. I feel like that is some of the brilliance of The Last of Us, that it's a game that makes you fully sympathize with this character that's clearly doing these morally ambiguous things, but making you very openly side with him. And obviously, like with him being the main character, so much of the game is obviously revolved around him, where we obviously get this tragic backstory for him, now seeing his reaction to Sarah's death and how that breaks him, only for us to then cut to 20 years later where he's clearly still affected by her death. And we obviously see his growing bond with Ellie, which ends up making him a really sympathetic character, and us being able to recognize the fact that he's starting to move on, really facing his former traumas due to the death of Sarah, that kind of make you overlook all these violent and heinous things that he does, where we see his ruthless reputation back in the Boston quarantine zone and him torturing Robert before his death. Yet despite these things, Joel's still a character that largely comes off as likable and understandable at that. Or despite him treating Ellie poorly throughout many portions of the early game, you still recognize why he's doing these things. It makes it even more impactful when he starts to open up towards the later chapters in the game. But really, for me, what really makes Joel's character is the ending. I mean, to me, the ending of The Last was still one of the greatest sequences in all of storytelling to me, to where I just really adore everything they do with Joel's decision. Not just in this decision of saving Ellie, which in essence dooms humanity, but really the motivations for doing so. Where again, he is making this move purely on selfish motivations. He is doing this despite the fact that he knows that Ellie doesn't want him to. And he's doing so solely because he recognizes that he can't take the loss of another daughter figure in his life. This moment of essential redemption for him. This redemption, him being able to stop the death of his daughter, which he had obviously failed at the beginning of the game, though in essence also stripping Ellie of her own redemption, her wanting redemption for the deaths of those caused by the infected, and Joel stripping her of that, adding to this further selfishness from Joel that, again, I just really adore. I really just love the complexity that's given to Joel during this outcome here, to where, again, there is obviously this baseline appreciation for how morally ambiguous his initial decision is, but further looking into the reasonings for it, I think further makes Joel a much more complex character, and really it is these complexities that make Joel far and away the best character in this game in my eyes, and again, for me, the best character in all of media. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every character in The Last of Us. Now, moving forward, that should be it for videos on the original Last of Us, but I've said that before, so who knows? Now, at some point, I think it could be interesting to do a similar thing to this for part 2, along with also redoing my part 2 retrospective, though don't know when that'll be, but at some point down the road, you expect that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.